Whether we toss a coin into a well, making a wish, or buy the latest range of spring water, promising the benefits of minerals to aid our health, we all have a relationship with the world of wells and springs. Even today, many of us feel there is something special, something to be revered about these places, of which are often the site of folklore, legend, and even today, tourist attractions. I set out on a journey to visit these holy wells and discover their untold and fascinating story. My first stop was a steep climb to the summit of Wapley Hill, the site of an Iron Age hill fort, and home to an obscure and mysterious well. Today it is out of bounds and covered up to prevent accidents. After all, it was dug to the incredible depth of 33 metres, over 100 feet. According to a long out-of-print book, The Healing Wells of Herefordshire, this well was the site of a sacred spring, home to lost offerings by Bronze and Iron Age people of the hill, of which the author concludes was less a fort and more an ancient religious centre. This poses an important question, and one very difficult to find an answer to. Did the Iron Age people dig the well, viewing it perhaps as a sign or even a passage into some other world? Or was the well there already, known to them from oral tradition, and prompting them to build their settlement close to it in the first place? Either way, we have long seen bodies of water as special and even sacred spaces. Votive offerings found in lakes have been dated to as early as the Neolithic, and this practice continued to increase until at least the late Bronze and early Iron Age, the same time that our ancestors on Wapley Hill built their settlement. These offerings have included statuettes showing animals or humanoid shapes, swords, shields, and of course, an abundance of ancient coins. Often, the items appeared to have been broken prior to being thrown in the lake, putting them beyond the use of mankind, suitable only for the spirits and gods of the water. These water deities were numerous, and for the early cattle and arable farmers of the Neolithic, it is perhaps no wonder. After all, access to a clean source of water would be necessary for sustaining the farm, and with it the farmers, of whom for the first time began to abandon the nomadic life and settle upon the land. Is it therefore any wonder that these water sources became personified with often female deities of fertility, healing, and the seasons? Indeed, by the time the Romans arrived in Britain, ample evidence was collected of many sacred springs and wells, often the site of religious importance, of which, such as in the case of the famous spring of Aquae Sulis in Bath, were swiftly appropriated by the Romans. Sulis had been worshipped at the spring since long before the Romans came onto the scene, and they simply supplanted her with their own deity, Minerva, and yet the name of the original deity stuck. In fact, here we can see one of the earliest suggestions of something rather strange and reoccurring in the study of holy wells. All over the country, the waters of these wells were said to heal conditions of the eye, including blindness, and many believe that Sulis too at least etymologically, may come from the Old Irish sual, meaning eyes and sight, or the Proto-Celtic forms of su and vel, good sight. Another water deity, first mentioned by the Romans in the 2nd century, was Sabrina, goddess of the River Severn, and my next stop was to be her shrine, found next to the River Severn in the town of Shrewsbury. On the way, I paid a short visit to this old holy well, now long since dried up, and allegedly the main village water supply, until mains water arrived in the 1950s. Strangely, this well was located in a place known as Eye Lane, once more suggesting a long-standing oral tradition of these wells and their connection with eyes and sight. In Shrewsbury, I saw the Shrine of Sabrina, or Halfren, as she is recorded by Geoffrey of Monmouth in his 12th century chronicle, History of the Kings of Britain. In this work, he describes Sabrina as a beautiful princess, of whom was also known as Saber or Sabren. She was thrown into the river and drowned, during a story of royal jealousy and scandal. Following this, the river was named after her, so that she would always be remembered. And here we see the origin of the river's name today, the Severn, after one of her names, Sabren, of where she also became a kind of water nymph or protective spirit of the river. Something still seen today with this wonderful poem at her shrine. Despite this peaceful garden, however, the River Severn is often violent and dangerous, and prone to devastating floods even today. Could such events have been seen as an act of the deity? An acknowledgement that just as the water source is needed to sustain life, it also has the power to take it away. They may have believed the river goddess was alive in the face of the waters, and she demanded our respect in return for the nourishment and healing of which she provided. My next stop was near to the town of Holywell, or Holywell, across the border into North Wales. Here, the history of holy wells becomes much more complex, entwined as it soon became with the arrival of the church, where the existing wells, already on sacred sites, became associated with the cults of the saints. In fact, the first book to be written on holy wells was Philip Dixon Hardy's book, Holy Wells of Ireland, where in 1836 he attacked the Catholic practice of venerating such wells, describing them, quite incorrectly, as sources of irreligion, immorality, and vice. Either way, the saints did indeed become, like Minerva before them, associated with the holy wells, and many churches were founded around these pre-existing sacred sites. Here at Holywell, I saw the shrine of Saint Winifred, a popular pilgrimage place even today, and housed in a 15th century chapel built by Lady Margaret Beaufort. Its origins are obscure, with its earliest mentions being once again connected to the healing of eyes and blindness. As well as this, another popular motif emerges here with the life of the saint, of whom it was said was beheaded, the spring miraculously appearing at the place where her head fell to the floor. This was of interest, as this story was just as popular as that of the healing of eyes. The well of St. Sidwell in Exeter, for example, shares almost the exact same story as Holywell, with the severed head of a saint hitting the floor, and in its spot, the holy well sprouting from the earth. We also see St. Juthware's well in Dorset, telling the same story, and St. Thomas's well at Windleshaw, again the same, with the well appearing in the place where a persecuted priest was beheaded. This recurring theme was of great interest, and seemed to shed light on the consciousness of the early church, of whom had a great interest in holy relics and hagiography. Many such stories appeared to come from the same source. The 14th century Nova Legendae Angliae by John Capgrave, itself a rearrangement of stories from an earlier author, John Tynemouth, of whom detailed the lives of 156 British saints. Herein lies a problem when examining the holy wells, of which over 3,000 may exist in Ireland alone, many of which having picked up a saintly association over the years. The problem is that writers like Tynemouth had very little information to go on, at most a collection of spoken fables surviving by fading oral tradition. It was their job to chronicle these stories and knit together the abundance of folk tales into a concise and believable life story of the saint. What resulted was often a jumble of stories compressed into a single tale, so that the life of the saint included fragments of folklore from long before the church arrived, and even from entirely different regions. Historical fact was of little importance, and so when a church was built over the site of an ancient spring or well, it was safe to say that it must have appeared when the head, body, or other relic of the saint touched the ground and the spring emerged. And as one virgin martyr was much like another, it was easy, if not entirely honest, to simply rework existing stories and ancient traditions to fit the new chronicle. One thing is certain: when a well became known as the realm of a saint, martyr, or miracle worker, pilgrims began to flock to the church, and the holy wells became popular and lucrative for the church, with pilgrims often purchasing an ampulla, a small container filled with the well water, said to be capable of bestowing the miracles attributed to the water and its named saint. In many ways, holy wells were like an early form of tourist attraction, complete with souvenirs, and this is no more clear than in my next destination, Mother Shiptons Cave, in my home county of North Yorkshire. Opening in the year 1630, Mother Shiptons is allegedly the oldest tourist attraction to charge a fee anywhere in England. Said to be the birthplace of 15th century soothsayer and prophetess Mother Shipton, or Ursula Southale, claimed by some to be a witch, and famous for her prophecies of the end of times, Mother Shiptons is still popular today. The well here is a rather special one. It comes from an underground lake and passes through rich deposits of sulphate and carbonate. The result is that artifacts left in the well water petrify or turn to stone, something that must have appeared truly magical to our forefathers. Today, visitors place their hands into the well to make a wish, leaving their hand to dry naturally. And if they so desire, they can leave an offering, such as a teddy bear, a scarf, or a shoe, to be slowly turned to stone by the magical waters. This is all quite wonderful. Votive offerings left at a spot in much the same way as in the earliest of times, when river deities like Sabrina and Sulis were venerated. You can even carry on the tradition of the ampulla by purchasing a small bottle of water from the Petrifying well to take home with you and make a wish. But not all springs and wells were destined to become attractions like Mother Shiptons Cave. Many were kept private, with small rural communities not wanting their wells to be recognised or visited by pilgrims, archaeologists, and curiosity seekers. They were, and often still are, sites of quiet reflection, the offerings left there having sometimes profound and other times deeply personal meanings. Last year, I discovered this tree with votive offerings by the side of a private stretch of the River Arrow. It was not a holy well as such, but it was clearly thought of in the same spirit, and would never be found on any tourist map, or earmarked for a TV historian to stand in front of and give a speech. Of course, it is easy for such sites to simply fade away when the folk memory is gradually forgotten, and in many cases where churches were built over existing wells, nothing now remains to say a sacred well was there to begin with. I called in at Coxwold Church, not far from Knaresborough, to see this for myself. It was built over the site of a sacred spring, a pre-Christian spiritual centre, and most likely the dwelling place of another water deity. But now, nothing remains for the average visitor to know this, and the well, if it still exists beneath the foundations, has likely long since dried up. Sadly, this fate has befallen a great number of holy wells. Many have dried, vanished, or even been destroyed, sometimes by changes in agriculture and environments, and other times simply because they are unknown, even by their local communities, of whom at one time would have known every corner of their homeland, and yet now pass by quickly, never pausing to notice what lays around them. And since many wells are on private land and have no historical or legal protection, they are left to crumble, to be overgrown by weeds and foliage, and ultimately to be forgotten. In places where the wells are known, however, there has been something of a small, yet still noticeable continuance of interest. In the Peak District, well dressing, or the practice of adorning holy wells with flowers and ornate designs, has continued in various forms since at least the 14th century. Each year, wooden frames are erected around the village wells, and a design is traced onto clay, of which is then added to it, often forming collages of seeds, flowers, and cones. Nobody can quite remember how this practice got started, but it certainly seems to harken back to the early days of venerating the wells and the spirits within them, and, even if nothing else, seems to create a splash of colour and beauty in the high villages of Derbyshire. There really does seem to be something intrinsically beautiful about holy wells. We feel drawn to them, even if the water has long since run dry. On my way back south, I thought about how the viewing of water as sacred was likely as old as humanity itself. Sacred lakes, wells and springs are amongst the oldest spiritual sites in the world, and were likely amongst the first places where people pondered the meaning of their lives, and as the stars reflected on the surface of the water, thought about their place in the universe. I went to Hay-on-Wye, where there was at one time an incredible 7 different holy wells, although today most have dried up, or like the main town well, been blocked off. This one, however, still ran, and it seemed to have resisted all forms of alteration by the adding of headless saints or other such similar things. The water was babbling and slightly warm, extremely refreshing on the hot day when I visited. There seemed something precious about it, something special of which eluded my senses. It was no surprise that such places may have been seen as the realm of spirits and gods, and that they may be seen to heal our eyes, like in all the old stories. Whether that's simply from the clean, warm water acting as a bath for eyes obscured by smoke, or in a more metaphysical manner, a healing of a silent and unseen eye, the tranquil nature of the sight luring us into the calm and quiet of which we all seek. There was, however, one more story to uncover on my journey, and it would take me to a strange place, of where I could see all the things that the medieval chronicle writers did not. The separate strands of culture and belief, no longer force-fitted into a single narrative. A place wherein all the beliefs came together, but were still viewable as separate from each other. There were actually 2 holy wells associated with this tale. The first, long since dried, was located on a quiet back street in the city of Hereford, said to be where Saint Ethelbert's headless body was momentarily laid down, so that his coffin bearers could rest while carrying it to the cathedral. In its place a well sprung up, and here we can see a weathered statue of the head of the saint on top of the hidden holy well. But the real treasure was around 8 miles north of Hereford, in the tiny village of Marden, where Saint Ethelbert himself was said to be slain, beheaded by King Offa of Mercia. Where his head hit the floor, a miraculous spring shot forth from the ground, a miracle so great that the church we see today was built on top of the existing well. But that was not all, for another folk story survives here too, far older than Saint Ethelbert, and yet somehow not erased by time. It concerned a mermaid of whom lived in a bell at the bottom of the river. One day, wishing to retrieve the bell, the people of the village devised a plan to tie it with ropes made from sacred trees and pull it from the river with 12 large cattle. Yet this must have been done in silence, as the mermaid slept inside the bell and should not be woken up. When they had almost pulled the bell from the water, one of the farmers shouted out in victory, "In spite of all the devils in hell, now we'll land Marden's great bell." The mermaid awoke, broke the ropes, and returned to the riverbed with the bell. This folk story is a clear memory of an ancient water deity, most likely venerated due to the fast-flowing river, of which even today is prone to flooding, just like we saw with the Severn and Sabrina. The holy well which stood on this land was almost certainly connected with this deity, of whom was later superimposed with the story of Saint Ethelbert and the popular motif of a missing head. And here, inside the church, hidden in a dark room at the rear amid a pile of old books, was the well itself, known to all as the place that Saint Ethelbert was beheaded, and the central point of which this church was built around. It was not dry, and seemed rather deep, its bottom not visible, but a small splash could be heard when I followed the many pilgrims of yore and tossed in a coin. But this story did not end there. In 1848, when dredging the river to the side of the well and church, a bell was discovered. It is now housed in Hereford City Museum, and is thought to be a kind of Celtic handbell, used primarily for funeral services, but originating as a type of ornate bell with associations of the saints. Here we can see the process of the folk tale becoming what we know today. A river deity was worshipped at the site of the well, later appropriated by the church and linked to the life of St. Ethelbert. Much later, a bell was lost in the river, and this too became part of the tale, taking the place of whatever votive offerings were originally left in the river for the ancient deity of whom is said to dwell there. Holy wells like this are fascinating. Like the ripples in their waters, their history is often fleeting and easily lost, found only in fragments of stories, offerings, and folk memory. But even without these things, we still feel a willingness to view such spaces as special, separate from the wider world. When we next throw a coin into a wishing well, remember that when doing so, we are acting in much the same way as the countless generations of vanished people of whom have taken to the waters before us.